think back to the night of June 29th, 2006. Nuremberg, Germany. Portugal against the Netherlands. A round of 16 match at the World Cup that started out as a football contest and ended as something a lot closer to a street brawl. 4 red cards, 16 yellow cards. A referee who lost control so completely, so thoroughly, that the match was eventually given a name of its own, one that still echoes across football history 2 decades later. The Battle of Nuremberg. It remains the most carded match in World Cup history. Russian referee Valentin Ivanov handed out those 16 yellows and 4 reds across 90 minutes that felt more like a war of attrition than a football match. Deco gone, Costinha gone, Khalid Boulahrouz gone, Giovanni van Bronckhorst gone. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, Luiz Figo, one of the most decorated players of his generation, headbutted Mark van Bommel near the touchline and somehow walked away with nothing more than a yellow card. The referee didn't even see it directly. His assistant had to inform him of what happened. That is how far off the rails the whole thing had gone. That record stood untouched for 20 years. A benchmark of football chaos that seemed, for 2 full decades, entirely safe. The kind of mark nobody was in any real hurry to approach. And then, last night, in Mexico City, in a stadium that has hosted 3 separate World Cup opening ceremonies across 6 decades of football history, the very first match of the 2026 World Cup came within a single red card of equaling it. 3 red cards, 2 of them for South Africa, who finished the game with 9 men. 1 for Mexico, who ended the night with 10. A match that opened with the color and noise and grandeur of the biggest opening ceremony this tournament has ever staged, and then descended, gradually and then all at once, into exactly the kind of football that leaves everyone talking the next morning. Not all of it has to be said, about the football itself. Mexico won 2-0. The scoreline is clean on paper. The story underneath it is anything but. So, what really happened at the Azteca last night? And what does it tell us about the World Cup that has just begun? Let's go through it from the beginning, because the chaos didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, layered over one of the most extraordinary opening ceremonies in tournament history. It built against a backdrop, a stadium, a city, a history that made everything that followed feel both improbable and somehow entirely fitting for a competition that has never once done anything quietly. The ceremony itself was extraordinary. There is no other word for it. Shakira performed the official tournament anthem for her 4th World Cup opening ceremony, a record that belongs only to her. Mana brought the full weight of Mexican rock tradition to a stage where 83,000 people were already buzzing with something that felt almost electric. Andrea Bocelli's voice filled the Azteca in a way that seemed to silence the crowd rather than excite it, a rare and remarkable thing in a stadium that loud. And then Salma Hayek appeared unannounced, and the stadium simply exploded. There is no more accurate description than that. Lila Downs welcomed the world in Spanish, English, Mixtec, and Nahuatl, the indigenous languages of the land on which the stadium stands, and in doing so said something about what Mexico understands that the primary host country of this tournament has repeatedly struggled to express, that the world arriving here includes people whose ancestors were on this land long before this stadium was ever built, long before football was ever played, long before a governing body got around to scheduling an opening ceremony. That welcome carries meaning wider than a ticket and a seat. It carries weight. And on a night when the conversation around this tournament had already become so loud and so politically charged, that gesture landed differently than it might have in any other year. And then the football began. Within minutes, the match had its first significant moment. South Africa's midfielder made a heavy touch just outside the penalty area. Mexico read it instantly. Julian Quiñones found the space that the error had created and struck the ball cleanly and low into the net. Right foot, low. Ronwen Williams in the South African goal had absolutely no chance. The Azteca erupted. Mexico won, South Africa 0. The first goal of the 2026 World Cup, scored inside the opening 10 minutes, born directly from a defensive mistake by a team that had spent the previous 11 days navigating a genuine logistical crisis, a stranded flight in Johannesburg, a visa emergency involving their entire traveling party. The very real pressure of being told, repeatedly, that they almost didn't make it to the match they were now playing. The kind of preparation that would fracture a less resilient squad before a ball was even kicked. South Africa did not collapse. That is worth stating clearly and loudly because the scoreline and the red card count might give the impression of a team that fell apart under pressure. They didn't. Hugo Broos's side showed exactly the same resilience that had carried them through a qualification group that included Nigeria, the continent's supposed dominant force, a team that isn't at this tournament while South Africa is. They organized, they pressed, they created moments and forced Mexico into decisions they didn't want to make. They reminded everyone watching that getting to 2-0 was going to require real work from the host nation's neighbors. And then the red cards started arriving. The midfielder whose heavy touch had directly contributed to the opening goal became the tournament's first dismissal in the second half. The exact nature of what earned him the card added yet another layer of tension to a match that already had more than enough. South Africa were down by a goal and now down to 10 men. The mathematics of their evening had shifted dramatically, but they kept playing, they kept competing, they kept finding reasons not to give up, and that is a measure of something genuine about this group of players. Mexico pressed their advantage the way home teams are supposed to, and then the substitution came. Raúl Jiménez entered the match. What followed is the moment that will still be replayed, when the red cards and the referee controversy and the administrative noise surrounding this tournament have long since faded into footnotes. Jiménez scored his first ever World Cup goal at 35 years old, at his 4th World Cup. In the stadium where he grew up watching football, he scored and then he pointed to the sky and the tears came, and 83,000 people who already loved him understood in real time exactly what they were witnessing. This man was not supposed to be playing professional football, not anymore. On November 29, 2020, a Premier League match at Arsenal's Emirates Stadium in London, Jiménez rose for an aerial challenge and collided directly with Arsenal defender David Luiz. He went down immediately and did not get up. Emergency surgery followed within hours. A fractured skull. A brain injury so severe that the initial concern was not whether he would return to football. The initial concern was whether he would return to normal life at all. Doctors worked to relieve pressure on his brain. He spent days in specialist care in London while his country held its breath. The recovery process was long, careful, and genuinely uncertain in ways that went beyond the usual timeline of a sports injury. Basic football actions had to be rebuilt from scratch. Heading the ball, once one of his greatest weapons, suddenly required a level of trust and confidence that doesn't come automatically when you have already fractured your skull once. He trained alone before he trained with teammates. He wore a protective head guard that gradually became part of his identity, something supporters recognized and adopted as a symbol of the kind of determination that can't be coached. 8 months after that night at the Emirates, he returned to competitive football for Wolverhampton Wanderers. Not gradually eased in. He came back. He kept scoring. He passed 45 international goals for Mexico, making him the 3rd highest scorer in the national team's history. He rebuilt a career that most people who watched him go down at the Emirates had quietly decided was over. He did it over years of careful work and consistent presence, the kind of long, unglamorous recovery story that doesn't produce highlight reels, but produces the kind of player who ends up scoring at a World Cup at 35. And then, in the months before this tournament, his father passed away. The man who had been there through all of it, through the injury and the surgery and the months of rehabilitation and the slow years of working his way back to a level that justified selection for a World Cup squad. When Jiménez scored and pointed to the sky and the tears came, he was doing what footballers do in the rare moments when the accumulated weight of an entire life becomes too much to contain within the ordinary boundaries of a goal celebration. He was pointing at his father. In a stadium where the memory of every great Mexican footballer who has ever played there lives in the noise of the crowd. He scored his first World Cup goal at 35 years old, 6 years after a skull fracture that threatened not just his career, but his life, months after losing his father, at the Azteca, in the stadium where he had spent years dreaming of exactly this moment. If you weren't moved by that, you genuinely weren't watching. And then the chaos reasserted itself with the kind of timing that makes football feel almost deliberate. Mothobi Mvala broke forward for South Africa. Cesar Montes, Mexico's center back, attempted to stop him and fouled him outside the penalty area. The referee reached for his pocket. Red card. Mexico were now down to 10 men as well. 3 red cards in the opening match of the 2026 World Cup, the joint second highest total in any World Cup match in history. One short of the Battle of Nuremberg's 4. South Africa with 9 men, Mexico with 10. The final minutes of the opening match of the biggest football tournament on earth looked less like the showcase that the governing body had imagined and more like a sport actively testing the outer limits of what a single referee can manage on the grandest possible stage. That referee, Wilton Sampaio of Brazil, had his own moment that spread across social media before the final whistle had even sounded. FIFA introduced a new communication system at this World Cup. In theory, referees use a stadium microphone to explain VAR decisions to the crowd. Transparency, accountability. A direct line between the official on the pitch and the 83,000 people in the stands who deserve to understand what is happening and why. In practice, at the Azteca last night, when Sampaio took the microphone to explain the decision that led to South Africa's second red card, almost no one in the stadium could understand a single word he said. The audio was unclear. The explanation generated more confusion than clarity. The clip spread immediately across every platform where football is discussed. A referee at the biggest match of the year, microphone in hand, trying to explain a critical decision to a packed stadium and producing something that became a viral symbol of good intentions that simply didn't survive contact with reality. It is difficult not to see that moment as a fairly precise metaphor for several other aspects of this particular tournament. There is also the question of the hydration break. FIFA mandated a 3-minute cooling break in the 22nd minute of each half across all World Cup matches at this tournament. The justification: player welfare. Extreme heat conditions across multiple host cities, particularly in venues across the southern United States and parts of Mexico. At the Azteca, at altitude, in the evening, those conditions were less acute than they will be in Houston or Monterrey in the weeks ahead. But the break happened regardless, and when the cameras cut away from the pitch for 3 scheduled minutes of broadcast advertising, the commentary that filled social media was pointed and specific. Players receive a compulsory hydration break at every match. The same governing body that introduced those mandatory breaks had, in the week before the tournament began, attempted to implement a policy banning supporters from bringing personal water bottles into the venues. The reversal of that ban, announced after the British Prime Minister publicly called it just wrong, was the right outcome. But its timing, arriving in precisely the same week as the first mandated player hydration break, illustrated a gap in institutional thinking that the opening night of the tournament did nothing to close. 2 decisions made by the same organization, pointing in opposite directions on the same issue, in the same week. Now, set all of that alongside what didn't happen at the Azteca last night. Omar Artan didn't happen. The CAF Referee of the Year, the first Somali ever to be selected for a World Cup, the 34-year-old official who had refereed at the highest levels of African football, including the Africa Cup of Nations, and who arrived at Miami International Airport with a valid diplomatic passport and a single-entry visa to the United States. He wasn't there. He spent 11 hours in an airport in Miami, subjected to questioning by U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials, who eventually placed him in a holding cell and then put him on a flight back to Istanbul, the city he had traveled from. He returned to Mogadishu to a hero's welcome from the Somali public. The U.S. State Department cited vetting concerns and suggested unspecified links to individuals with suspected connections to terror organizations. A claim Artan and his supporters rejected entirely. He had the right papers, he had the credentials, he had the visa. He had earned his place at this tournament through years of professional development in one of the most difficult environments in world football. And yet, the man who would have been in that stadium, managing those red cards, explaining those VAR decisions into a microphone, overseeing the most watched opening match in World Cup history, was sitting in Mogadishu instead. Within hours of the final whistle at the Azteca, the news broke that UEFA had stepped in. The organization that governs European football handed Artan the appointment for the 2026 UEFA Super Cup final, the match between the Champions League winner and the Europa League winner, one of the most prestigious club fixtures in the European calendar. The continent that runs football on one side of the Atlantic used the moment to say something about how it views what happened on the other side. The contrast was noticed. It was noted loudly and publicly, and it will remain part of the record of this tournament, written in permanent ink alongside everything that was decided on the pitch. Think about what the Battle of Nuremberg actually produced beyond its well-earned reputation for chaos. It produced Manish's goal, a strike of such ferocious quality that it remains one of the most technically beautiful goals in World Cup knockout history. Scored in the middle of a match that had otherwise completely abandoned any pretense of beauty. It produced the specific crackling tension of watching a game where the referee had lost the thread entirely and absolutely anything felt possible. Those moments of genuine unplanned drama, the ones that nobody scripted and nobody saw coming, are the ones that embed themselves deepest in the collective memory of a tournament. Nobody planned the Battle of Nuremberg. Nobody planned for the 2026 opener to end with 9 men against 10. Nobody planned for a referee's microphone explanation to go viral before the final whistle. These are the things a World Cup adds to itself. The chaos that the governing body doesn't write into the script and can't prevent when 90 minutes of football actually begins. The opening match of a World Cup carries weight that extends well beyond its 90 minutes. Think about the matches that set the tone for the tournaments that followed them. South Africa's Sifiwe Tshabalala scoring that opening goal in 2010, the first World Cup on African soil, with the vuvuzelas creating a sound that had never existed in a football stadium before and has never quite been replicated since. France losing to Senegal in 2002, the defending champions knocked out by an African nation in a match that sent a message to the rest of the world about what was coming. Germany and Costa Rica in 2006, a 6-3 match in the opening game that announced with absolute clarity that this particular tournament was going to be about goals and open football and spectacle. Every opening match says something. Every one of them announces a temperature. Last night's match announced that the 2026 World Cup intends to be felt, that the football will not be polite, that the stories will arrive whether the governing body manages them or not, that a 17-year-old named Gilberto Moura, the youngest player from North America ever to appear at a World Cup, born after the 2006 tournament itself had already taken place, can come off the bench at the Azteca on opening night and write himself into history without anyone having planned that chapter in advance. That Raúl Jiménez can score his first World Cup goal at 35 years old, in his 4th tournament, at the stadium where he grew up, and point to the sky, and make 83,000 people feel the full weight of a human life compressed into a single gesture. That South Africa can arrive having been stranded on a runway in Johannesburg, navigate an 11-day visa crisis involving their entire traveling party, fly to the most famous football stadium on earth, and finish the night with 9 players still standing and something undeniably real to show for it. This tournament has been surrounded by more institutional noise than any World Cup in living memory. The red cards and the tears and the microphone that nobody could understand, and the hydration break and the water bottle ban reversal, and the shadow of a referee who should have been there and wasn't. None of that is what the governing body planned for its opening night. All of it is what the World Cup actually produced. And in the end, that is what this competition has always done. It takes what it's given. It takes the ceremony and the politics and the logistics and the institutional decisions and the administrative controversies, and out of all of it, it makes something that nobody could have written in advance, something that belongs entirely to the 90 minutes of football and the people playing in them. Last night at the Azteca, the 2026 World Cup announced itself. Not quietly, not politely, not according to any plan, just loudly, chaotically, and entirely on its own terms, the only way it has ever known how.